Okay, fast forward to the Panic of 1837. This actually occurs after Jackson kills the second bank in the United States. First, he in 1833 rules that the government can't put money into it anymore, and in 36 finally kills it and allows its charter to run out. 20-year charter that started in 1816. Panic 1837 was under Martin Van Buren's watch. Many bank failures due to unstaked money. Again, issuance by different banks. But since no central bank and no nationalization occurred in 37, the economy recovers with real GDP began rising again in 1838. So it's clear that we already have an association with recovery being quick as long as federal intervention is minimal. Panic of 1857, 20 years later. Many bank failures due to a typical real estate bubble and a gold bubble bursting. Now, this is somewhat related to railroad expansion and the easier expansion moving toward the west. There was a gold bubble that burst when many gold reserves actually sunk in a shipping accident. So the gold standard that Jackson was able to enable eventually heads the two-edged sword, of course, of if the reserves are somehow compromised. That in this case, a shipping accident lost many gold reserves. It was a one factor of many. Some being that the valuations of properties were dropping, causing a bubble to burst in 57. But since the expansion was a gold-staked expansion, and trade barriers were lowered thanks to the Buchanan administration and Congress, the recovery was relatively fast. Once again, no nationalization, no stimulus. Panic 1873. Definitely caused by railroad industry speculative bubble. By that time, the railroad was connected east coast to west. There were contributing factors to that panic. Black Friday of 1869, Chicago Fire 71, Coinage Act devaluing silver in 73. Again, no central bank, but a series of financial and corruption scandals, Boss Tweed and whatnot. Essentially a bunch of Ulysses Grant cronies, and labor conflicts prolonged investor fears until the recovery was clearly in play in 1879. Fast forward another 15 years. Panic 1893, caused by a second railroad industry speculative bubble. Bank runs, a classic bank runs, and a contraction of money supply were the painful remedies. This is the right way to contract a bubble. Bank runs and money supply contracting naturally by the raising of interest rates and the selling of bonds, by government-backed banks. But the lack of government intervention allowed a relatively quick recovery. The expansion began again with the Klondike Rush of 1896. Again, no nationalization, no stimulus, thanks to the Cleveland administration and Congress, but a short panic in 96 helped him be defeated that year. Okay, now let's get to where the more modern history. The Panic of 1907. This was caused by bank trusts which were attempting to corner the copper market for some reason. They saw a collaborative interest there, and again, this is kind of following the antitrust movement from by Teddy Roosevelt. There was certainly a lot of trust in collaborative activities that wouldn't be allowed nowadays, but in the case of these banks conspiring to kind of corner the market on a commodity, there was a a failure to do so, in part because of foreign intervention. And once one bank failed, it caused a classic bank run. Interestingly, the very rich financier J.P. Morgan convinced other wealthy financiers to deposit and loan money to the failing banks to save them. Government intervention not needed. There was no central bank still at this time, so there was no call for nationalization or stimulus. The crisis ended within a few months, but the calls for the government to stabilize banks during a run, because there was a lot of drama in 1907. There were some very close calls where the banks easily could have experienced a cascading failure. But as a result, there was a call to create a government entity or a government central bank to stabilize the financial system during a run, as people started to see the interconnected nature of the financial system. As I mentioned, there was a secret meeting on Jekyll Island by bank CEOs and rich folks, and they architected what is now the Federal Reserve. It was eventually made into a bill and passed by Wilson in 1913. He signed it. Interestingly, he later regretted it, and this was well before the Depression. He died in 1921, so he already regretted it just a few years later. 1929 crash, the Great Depression. Again, cause was unstaked monetary expansion by the Fed, by a central bank. The effect was an inflated speculative bubble much bigger than it would have been. Recovery was delayed many years by government spending, erection of trade barriers through Smoot-Hawley, and the institution of price controls. Really radical price and wage controls by the Roosevelt administration. The Reconstruction Finance Corporation was created to give loans to banks and other businesses to keep them afloat, but again, no nationalization, but a lot of stimulus. This was really the first gigantic stimulus idea. Of course, Austrians believed that the stimulus did nothing but just delay the recovery, because it diverted funds from the private sector, disrupted normal private supply and demand, in favor of make-work jobs at great price, as every public job probably causes two private jobs to be lost through opportunity costs and by determinative investment. Savings and loans, 1980s. The cause of that was a typical real estate bubble, but this time in conjunction with inadequate regulation to assure viability of both lenders and borrowers. And this is the beginning of the problem with securitization and the bundling of loans in an obscure way, the creation of junk bonds, etc., Michael Milken, etc., Ivan Boesky, and the whole crew. Recovery was accomplished mainly by government bailout, as we are doing now, financed by both taxpayers and foreign banks. The thing is, the size of that bailout was a little more affordable than it is nowadays. Okay. Now, with that background, I will talk next about today's subprime mortgage crisis with that context.